I'm Criswell again, and this is Chris Miller from Armstrong, and I'm from Marshall. And today our group presentation is going to talk about leading with relevance. So, next slide. So 50 years ago, NASA led humans out of Earth's gravity and onto an alien world for our first steps. So our success made history and spotlighted NASA as the leader of space exploration. Our country continued to choose to do the hard things. We are the people that everyone looks towards to achieve the hard stuff, to dare mighty things for the benefit of all. Ad Astra. Now these mantras, this image, this is nothing new. You guys are the choir. So the things that we're preaching about is nothing you've not heard before. This is, however, a message that is meant to share the insights of this multi-center group of what we've learned. So now look at this image from 50 years ago. It captures the vast emptiness of space, how our blue marble floats in solitary orbit around the sun, the moon's magnificent desolation. It can feel a little lonely. But now if we take the time in 2020 to reflect and look in our rearview mirror, we have company. After 50 years, 5 decades of spaceflight, we have company with a lot of, we've democratized and we've commercialized space. So we have commercial entities and countries now that have this capability. This is a good thing. This is also a NASA success. So we need to take pride because we've rewritten these textbooks. We've shared the discoveries that have been taught to multiple generations. So now with our new partners, commercial and international, we need to draw an analogy from our SELP time at Gettysburg. The battlefield has changed. So we need to, at Gettysburg, we learned that new situations demand a new, fresh approach. So as leaders in the space exploration, we need to assess this battlefield. And we need to take in this insight and not overlook the new battlefield. Take note and adjust our strategy. Failure to take the time to reflect will be the slow fade to obscurity that none of us want. Past administrators and administrations have unanimously said this is an and not an or. So the question now becomes how and who does the what? How do we maintain relevance and evolve as an agency? Who leads and executes parts of our country's mission, commercial or government? And finally, the what? What missions do we focus our finite resources, money, and workforce on? So today, we'll focus on the how for NASA to adapt more successfully. One thing our group is in vehement agreement on is that even with our commercial support, more of it, our flagship missions must obviously be integrated, and we are that integrator. So one of the reasons we say this is because over the past years, you've already heard that we've benchmarked almost every NASA center, saw some amazing companies, amazing workforce at NASA centers, amazing capabilities out there. So the rest of our brief will boil down our insights and how we will maintain our relevance.
Thanks, Kent. As Kent said, as participants in this program, we've been given a pretty unique opportunity to survey the ecosystem that NASA lives in. And over that last year and a half, our group, from our experiences that we've gained, have identified 4 key strategies for NASA to remain relevant in an increasingly competitive and fast-paced environment. The first is to distill and understand NASA's legacy so that we can prune things that no longer serve our mission. The second is we need to avoid outsourcing our future. Third, we need to transform perceived competitors into partners. And finally, we need to redefine and adapt our relationship to risk. So let's talk a little bit about legacy. Our legacy at NASA is forged in both bold triumphs but it's also been shaped by profound sorrow. I was in elementary school when we lost Challenger and her crew. And as I wept for the loss of STS-51 and her crew, I was mourning something a little bit more personal, a childhood belief in the infallible and inevitable success of everything that America sought to do. But a more profound and deeper belief grew up in its place, a belief in our ability as a nation and as a people to grow and to learn from our failures and to pursue even grander and bolder missions. When we're at our best, we leverage what we learn in both our failures and our successes to push farther and thus honor those that came before us. However, when we fail to learn the right lessons, we risk becoming bloated and irrelevant. Others without the hard-won wisdom of our legacy, they take the lead, and they risk repeating our failures and experiencing our sorrow. As technical people, it's often easier to talk about O-rings or foam than it is to go deeper and actually talk about what really happened. Sometimes, as engineers, it's also easy to focus in on the solution, because that's what we like, right? We like to get into those solutions. But one of the things that I've learned in mentoring young people is that when all you talk about is the solution and you don't share the story behind that solution, the process becomes the value, becomes the lesson learned. But you can't treat the process as gospel, because that isn't the lesson. And at JPL, we saw them doing this really, really well. They push everybody to own the story. And that allows them to be adaptable and flexible when things that have served them in the past, processes that were great, that were founded on good principles, those aren't serving them anymore. They're able to prune those and move on, but keeping that core of who they are. We as an agency, we have to get better at telling the stories behind our lessons learned and teaching others how to apply those lessons to an increasingly dynamic and complicated world. With commercial crew flights on the very near horizon, the time could not be better to pour ourselves into telling our stories. We got to visit the Columbia room while we were here at KSC, and it was moving. And I hear that they're going to put that on, they're going to do a road show, and they're going to go to a couple of NASA centers. That's a great start, but that's not enough. It needs to go to our partners. It needs to go to every NASA center, because our story, our legacy is worth a much larger investment than that. And we need to do it. So outsourcing, it's a fun topic. With an organization with as much raw talent and capability as NASA has, it can be really hard for us to identify what we should be doing for ourselves and what we should be buying from others, what we should be outsourcing. And as the capacity of private industry grows, that choice becomes even harder and harder. We'll find ourselves in a position where things that we had to do for ourselves, now we have options. We can buy that option. And that's really good for both NASA and the nation. We can offload some of those things and not repeat, and we can actually look to the future and do something bigger and bolder. However, that also brings with it some profound risks. In one of the books that we read for this program, the author gave an example of Dell, who, making really smart business decisions, was offloading key capabilities to a budding competitor. And by doing so, they ended up losing their place at the top of the personal computer market. While the Dell example is not a perfect analogy to our relationship between NASA and our partners and our suppliers, we can't deny its similarities either. I know I've had some personally very awkward conversations with friends and family about NASA being, quote, out of business now that SpaceX and others are doing some things that have traditionally been ours. So at least in the public's eye, there's a very real relevancy question for us that we have to answer. But NASA's basic research and our ability to design and test flight hardware, both in flight and in ground facilities, that's part of who we are. It's in our DNA. We saw some really world-class facilities like test stands at Stennis and wind tunnels at Ames and research aircraft at Armstrong and vacuum facilities at Glenn, that those facilities can be used to facilitate hands-on work that our people need in order to keep their technical skills sharp. We've identified, and as a group, we've identified a number of things, 3, that we think need to be done in order to maintain NASA's core competencies, our expertise in this increasingly outsourced and competitive world that we find ourselves in. First, we need to develop a strategic plan for maintaining critical technical skills and facilities that NASA's workforce needs to be relevant in the future. Second, we need to fund hands-on work for NASA's people to do. We don't need a James Webb every 10 years to build our core capabilities. And honestly, one big complicated spacecraft every 10 years isn't a great way to maintain core competency anyway. What we need is faster, smaller, less expensive missions that can be accomplished with in-house labor and facilities that can help protect our technical expertise for the future. Sometimes just because we can buy it doesn't mean that we should. Third, and finally, we need to remove barriers to cross-center collaboration. It should be invisible and seamless to work across center boundaries. I know I've tried to work on a number of collaborations with other centers that have died on the vine because of the complexity of moving people, money, or resources from one center to another. It needs to be easy to work together. If one center has a dormant capability that another center needs, it should be a no-brainer that we should be able to work together. As a kid growing up in the 80s, I didn't have to wonder very often who our perceived enemy was. Pop culture, movies, everything reflected the fact that we were very much in a Cold War with the Soviets. However, even at the height of the Cold War, US and the Soviets were able to see past our very earthly differences and discover that our aspirations for humanity in space were better served in collaboration and peace. And they pulled off one of the boldest experiments that I think the agency's ever done, which is Apollo-Soyuz. And if we can do that in the darkest days of the Cold War, we should be able to collaborate with our domestic partners. Sadly, all too often, we get more of the sentiment in the picture on the right, on the right, I guess it's my left, that somehow private industry and the government's interests somehow run contrary to one another. And I get it, right? You can ask my wife. My board game playing gets a little out of hand sometimes. We're competitive by nature. But seriously, though, if you look at Elon Musk and our administrators' Twitter accounts, you can see that there is a tension there. There very much is some improvement that can be done in our ability to work constructively with one another. And our group has identified 4 things that we think are critical for improving that relationship and that perception of our ability to work with our partners. First, we need to do a better job of communicating both internally and externally what NASA and what partner contributions to successful missions have been. For instance, I had no idea that the initial designs for SpaceX's rocket engines were Marshall designs until I worked with somebody at Marshall and they told me about it. Second, we need to jointly celebrate success. If we acknowledge that we don't succeed without them and they don't succeed without us, that sends a powerful message to the public. And third, we need to encourage and facilitate benchmark exchanges with our partners. I know that personally, my whole perspective on commercial space was changed by the benchmark that we did at SpaceX. I walked out of there with a completely different understanding. Those close relationships, just meeting people, has a profound way of changing your perspective on what they're doing. And finally, we need to explore technical workforce exchanges with our partners. If we could find a way for NASA technical people to work right alongside partner technical people, that would go a long way in both maintaining our core competencies as well as building strong relationships with our partners. And our last strategy, we need to redefine and adapt our relationship to risk. Common misperception about accepting risk is that somehow that means gambling with people's lives. It was clear from our benchmarks at the different NASA centers and across the industry that there's many different ways to manage and accept and buy down risk. For instance, at Google X, we learned that they try to prove that how something will fail as early as possible and then make it fail. At SpaceX, hardware is not precious, but people are. They try to find a way to test hardware as soon as they can so that they can uncover and fix failures before they ever get to a big integrated test. Sometimes at NASA, it feels like we get paralyzed by the failure is not an option mindset. We let the scale and the cost of things grow so large that before we do a real test, then that real test has to succeed. How can we change our mindset on risk without creating an elevated risk to our friends who are eventually going to fly on these vehicles? First, we need to stop treating small failures like they're big failures. If we cultivate a culture where it's okay to break something or fail a small-scale test, we'll be able to buy down risk sooner and at a much lower cost than if we wait until the test has to succeed. And secondly, we need to change how we assess and accept risk. We need to push decisions down to the lowest level where people are the closest to the problem and have the most knowledge about the actual risk. And then we need to give them the authority and the ability to manage that risk. This may seem simple, but it will only be possible if we define and implement new risk strategies and processes and then actually stick with them. So in closing, the nation and humanity need NASA. We owe it to our future to remain relevant. We cannot let our best days be in the past, enshrined in some museum somewhere. NASA has some really big and important decisions that we need to make. And then that will set the course of the agency for the next generation. We know that we've made some pretty bold assertions, and we've asked for some pretty big changes and pretty big actions. But we as a group, we're committed to this agency that we love. Leverage us to help make the changes that we have suggested that resonated with you, and we will follow your lead. Thank you.